You're listening to the Curio-city Collective podcast.
I'm Arpita.
And I'm Deepika.
Lately I've been doing an inventory of the sorts of things that turned up again as a vague sense of normalcy seemed to return. Just sights and sounds I didn't hear around me through those periods of lockdowns and restrictions. And of course, no one was missing the traffic, which is back now, but it struck me one day rather suddenly that one of the nicest sounds to be interrupted was that of kids playing outside in the community and around.
Yeah, totally. I mean, in my community, they have this little gang of girls who play football and cycle together and whatnot, just super active teenagers. And watching them confined through the last few years has been really sad to see.
When will this end? Are we at the worst part of the pandemic, or is it going to get worse? And when is the next time I can actually go out and leave my house? Because you can do that now, but you're still running a huge risk. When will the risk be so low that I can actually go? I'm free!
That's my neighbor's 11-year-old daughter, one of the members of that little gang, Kristen, who we spoke to during the first lockdown in 2020. And you can hear from her voice what it felt like to be stuck indoors and just the uncertainty that's constantly been a part of all our lives in these last few years.
And to think 2020 was just the beginning of it all. She's done a great job there of putting to words what we've all felt at some point or the other through the last few years, whatever our age. But as the months turn to years, just seeing my nephews and my friends' kids growing up with all these million restrictions, one can't help but feel rather bad for them. It's been particularly difficult for kids, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And I think even the 2021 United Nations State of Children's report put a spotlight on children's mental health. Considering all the stresses children are undergoing, it highlighted the need, for instance, of promoting, protecting, and caring for children's mental health. Because as they put it, the pandemic may represent only the tip of a mental health iceberg, and it's an iceberg we've ignored for far too long.
Yeah, and I think in the spirit of doing just that, understanding and thinking deeper on children's mental health and larger well-being, present and future, it just made perfect sense to speak with Dr. Praveetha Patalay.
Hi, my name is Praveetha Patalay. I am an associate professor based at University College London in London.
Praveetha uses large national studies to investigate mental health through a person's life course, and her recent research has highlighted the increasing levels of mental health difficulties faced by the current generation of young people in the UK.
I mainly research population mental health, so I'm interested in everybody's mental health across the whole spectrum, from good mental health to mental illness. And I am also interested in mental health across the life course. So that means I'm interested in how the same person's mental health develops from when they're a young child for the rest of their lives. And I study inequalities in mental health. So, who is more likely to suffer with poor mental health, but also the sort of things we might do to improve mental health, both in terms of reducing illness, but also promoting well-being.
I do want to say that I'm really looking forward to what Praveetha is saying there in terms of not just being interested in illness, but also wellness.
Oh yeah, understanding the whole spectrum of possibilities for children's mental health is really quite exciting. Looking at wellness also helps us think about what needs to change, how we can do things differently for kids to not just be illness-free, but genuinely happy. And also, the bit about studying inequality stands out to me. In the last decade or so, the psychosocial approach is garnering more and more support amongst professionals. It's an approach where we look at both the individual and their social context to begin to understand more holistically their physical and mental wellness and ability to function.
And it seems pretty intuitive, really, doesn't it? That an experience of living in uncertainty or oppression can lead to higher stress and pressures on an individual.
Yeah, it seems intuitive, but strangely it hasn't. It's taken its time as an idea, but I'm glad that we're really beginning to see work that puts together the experiences of illness, vulnerability, and inequality.
And this in the context of children. So tell me, how did she get interested in the wellness of children?
She said she had always been interested in children's development.
childhood is such an interesting and sort of important stage of life. And I think the reason I studied or came to mental health is because obviously it's really sad when anybody has very poor mental health, but I think when children have very, very bad mental health, I think it's a really sad thing, because childhood is meant to be a period of, learning, curiosity, growth, and joy. And if you're really struggling instead, so I think that's why I'm interested in mental health. That's how I got interested in mental health, through wanting to try and improve children's mental health.
And it's not just that poor mental health has repercussions during childhood, where it can disrupt the child's immediate functional life, but also what's been observed is that poor mental health at a young age can have repercussions within one's lifetime.
So I think they're really important the first 2 decades of life. So for 80% of people who will have sort of mental health difficulties through their lives, it first appears in adolescence, so before the age of 20. So for most people, mental health difficulties are adolescent onset. So I think focusing on this phase of life, if we're really interested in prevention and helping before problems, because the way the health system works is we wait for people to get really, really ill and really struggle, and only then, sometimes offer help, even not all the time. Like even the health system doesn't have the capacity to help everyone struggling with their mental health.
Yeah, of course, that makes paramount sense. And, we've heard that adage forever, haven't we? That prevention is better than cure.
And childhood can be such a critical and foundational period of life, really. Praveetha pointed out that the domino effects of poor health early in life can be far beyond the domain of health. It can affect all elements of your life.
So I think from a prevention perspective, adolescence is really important, but also from a sort of consequences perspective, because if you health generally, not just mental health, but also mental health in early life has lifelong consequences, not just for your health, but also for, your labor market outcomes, your relationships, your, social outcomes, your economic outcomes. So I think, again, so it's interesting. I think child and adolescents are interesting because if you really want to understand the risk factors and, things that lead to young people struggling with their mental health, that's when you should look, because for most young people, that's when it starts. But also if you really want to help and prevent, that's when you should look as well.
I think it can't be said enough. Children's emotional well-being is just as important as their physical health, because good mental health can help them develop the resilience to cope with whatever life throws at them and just grow into well-rounded, healthy adults.
And Praveetha emphasized why it's important to study the full spectrum from illness to wellness, as you put it, because being healthy is not just the absence of illness. Things can be much more complicated.
Health, like all of health, is not just about the absence of illness. It's also about good health. So, for example, you could not have any chronic illness, but still not be very healthy. But equally, you could have asthma or type 1 diabetes, and you could be an international sports star. So I think with mental health, it's the same. Just the absence of disease doesn't mean you're mentally healthy. So although the focus in mental health tends to be very much on illness, even if you didn't have illness, you still want good mental health. So I think it's the same sort of distinction as you would make for health, more broadly speaking. And this is reflected in how, for example, the World Health Organization and stuff define health. Health is always defined not just by disease. It's more than the absence of disease. And there's so much obsession with increasing life expectancy and stuff. And I always think, what's the point of living longer if you're not living, better, more well and happy lives? And nobody seems obsessed with how we can live more well and happy lives.
That makes infinite sense. And as simple as it seems to say that one must map the whole spectrum of things, how do you actually go about it? I imagine that can get pretty complicated.
Yeah, Praveetha shared how the way one goes about defining the two concepts for research differs.
Yeah, so if you think about mental ill health and well-being from a research perspective, it would involve sort of mental ill health would tend to focus on symptomology, so symptoms of depression, symptoms of psychosis, whereas well-being tends to focus on, for example, life satisfaction. So how satisfied you are with your life, flourishing, how worthwhile you think your life is. So it's not, well-being is not just happiness. It's much more than happiness. It's, feeling like you have meaning and purpose and doing things you want to do. So in research, you sort of, I guess, mainly differentiate between them, at least in data, by the way you ask questions about them.
And in terms of the actual questions, it would be something like this.
Imagine measure of psychological distress. They will tend to ask you questions around symptoms of depression, anxiety. So, for example, low mood, whether you're feeling not worthwhile and feeling anxious and worried and tense, low energy, fatigue, all of those sort of symptoms. Whereas well-being measures will tend to ask you questions like, overall, considering your life, how satisfied are you with the way things are going? How worthwhile do you think, how worthwhile do you feel your life is, and that type of things.
We don't often really think about it quite like that, na? I mean, as I'm listening to Praveetha, I'm trying to just think of how I would go about responding to such questions. And while the illness ones seem easier to respond to because, usually a person can explain what they might actually be going through, but how many of us actually consider what might constitute a meaningful life for us?
Yeah, it's an approach that makes things much larger than the immediate, right? And here we are also trying to proactively imagine what a good life looks like and how we might wish to chart a path to it. And these are questions that require contemplation. It's funny now to think how we don't ask ourselves these questions more often, really.
Yeah, but frankly, I can't help but think how each of us is a unique combination of so many variables. We are kind of like in that gray area between illness and wellness and just a mix of both, I guess.
What you find with these type of data is, as you can probably imagine, they're not exactly the opposite of one another. So you can have people who are struggling with their mental health, who might have symptoms of depression and anxiety, but equally think their life's worthwhile and they're satisfied with the way things are going. And equally, you could have people with absolutely no symptoms, but who still don't think their life is worthwhile or, what they would like it to be. So the absence of symptoms in data doesn't seem to correspond with high well-being. And similarly, the absence of well-being doesn't necessarily correspond with mental illness.
I think as someone who's worked in the development sector, I can really relate to that. I mean, there are days when you're cursing the state of the world and the largeness of these difficult issues, but there's actually so much meaning in the work that you do when you're supporting even one individual, in those small actions that you are able to take. And somehow those contradictory states of mind and emotions, they all coexist within us. But if each of us is indeed such a mix, how do we really begin to understand which elements of life to cover under the idea of what constitutes well-being?
I think trying to define these grey, very large concepts can be challenging for researchers, but as Praveetha explained it, they've taken an approach where they try their best to let people express how they feel about their lives without bracketing them under one notion or idea of what constitutes well-being.
I like the life satisfaction questions, though, because they don't make any assumptions about what satisfaction, what your satisfied life needs to look like. So it's not making assumptions about, relationships, work, because everybody's definition of their life well lived will be very different. So in some ways, just thinking about your own life, are you satisfied with where it is? I think is actually probably better than trying to pin down specific things and ask people about their relationships and their jobs and whatever else, because for people, you don't know how much those things are salient for different people. So it's almost, I think, better to have a general question.
So I think that gives us a good sense of the structure that Praveetha has been using for her research work. And understanding that structure, I think, helps understand the outcomes also a little bit better. But tell me, did Praveetha say what research has been telling us about the nature of adolescent mental health?
She broadly outlined what's been emerging from research about the state of adolescent mental health across multiple countries in the last few years.
So if you take long temporal view of trends, there is suggestion from data from many countries. Obviously, some countries have better data than others, but that more recent generations of young people having worse mental health than prior generations. I think there's also other trends in parallel with that are sort of what sort of noting, which are around, for example, things like health more broadly. So sleeping behaviors, weight, physical activity. So lots of things that are sort of all trends, all developing in the same direction. So, and there's other things that you could argue are better health outcomes. So less young people, at least in countries like Britain and the US, are smoking and drinking than was previously the case. So it's not like all health determinants are sort of changing for the worse, but mental health does seem to be getting worse.
As she's based out of UK, she pointed particularly to the trends being seen there in terms of mental health across generations.
Okay, so if you look at generations born in the 50s, compare them to people born in the 70s, and then to people born in the 90s, and then in the 2000s, you see generation on generation teenagers having higher levels of sort of depressive and anxiety symptoms, also tending to have higher levels of sort of self-harm behavior. So yeah, it seems to be a sort of trend that has been going for a few decades.
I wonder how this compares to trends in countries like India.
Well, interestingly, Praveetha did point out how trends for some countries are easier to figure versus others simply because of data collection and availability issues.
As far as I know, the trend seems to be the case in most countries. As I also alluded to, though, obviously some countries have better mental health data than others. So the sort of quality of evidence may not be equally strong. However, it does seem to be the case in most places, whether it's low and middle income countries or high income countries. Generally, mental health research happens much more in high income countries than low and middle income countries. So the sort of research capacity in low and middle income countries for mental health research is very, very low.
In India, a national mental health survey was first undertaken only as recently as 2015-16. The report showed that 7.3% of those in the 13 to 17 age group had mental disorders, and that's nearly 9.8 million people. The rate was similar for both boys and girls, but a trend will emerge only once we have more such large-scale national surveys in the coming years. Praveetha also pointed out how most of this research is done by psychiatrists, and often in countries like India, there's a paucity of people qualified to do this research.
If you think about number of psychiatrists per million people, the numbers are very, very small in most parts of the world. And so there isn't sort of the research capacity or interest in mental health, broadly speaking, not just young people's mental health. And even if there was, it's probably mostly in adult mental health, because that's how it tends to be. Adolescent mental health has traditionally been very sort of overlooked and underserved, even in high-income industrialized countries.
So one big gap is that there's been very little research done on adolescent mental health world over. And not just research, in fact, I mean, it's an issue that hasn't got its due attention. And this is, of course, one of the big points that the UN State of Children's Report 2021 is also making. It points holistically to the poor investment by states across the world in building systems that respond to and support children, and lobbies for that to change. But as someone who's worked on the issue of child rights, I'm also curious, how does one do this kind of research with kids? Because, adolescence itself is such a big age group. Depending on how you want to define it, it can be anywhere between, the age of 10 to 20 years old. And with each year, you experience such massive shifts of physical and emotional growth.
Yeah, a 13-year-old is obviously quite developmentally different from, say, a 17-year-old. So the question of who reports and how one reports on children's mental health is a really valid one.
I think it's a really important question. So for a long, long time, most researchers used proxy reporters, so somebody else, usually parents, sometimes teachers. And I think that's a problem. Young people can tell you about their mental health if you ask them in age-appropriate ways. If you ask me, teenagers probably can tell you about their mental health better than anybody else. I mean, it's the same thing for adults, right? Think about adult mental health. Nobody's asking the adult's mother or their partner or their child about their mental health. And I don't understand why at the magical age of 18 you can ask somebody, but you can't ask them when they're 17 or 16.
Having worked closely with children, I find it so funny now to imagine that one would ask a parent what's happening with the child. Because I think half the time that's the question most parents are asking themselves. Teenagers are such a mystery to most adults in their lives.
Totally, and I can well imagine Praveetha's frustrations as a researcher just dealing with that bias.
So I remember when I started doing child mental health research, I was in my early 20s, and I went to this talk by, senior professor who presented all parent-reported data and said something about, why they wouldn't use teenagers' own reports. And these are 15-year-olds, so, they're not small children. And so I asked, why don't you ask the 15-year-olds themselves about their mental health? And I paraphrase a bit, but they said something along the lines of, they're teenagers, what do they know?
We don't like it when someone speaks for us, so I wonder why we assume it's okay to do so on behalf of teenagers.
Clearly, Dr. Seuss all those years ago was trying to say something vital both to children and on behalf of children with his very famous line from that book, Horton Hears a Who. A person's a person no matter how small.
I love that line, and really it's a question to ask ourselves, not only as researchers, but as any adult engaging with children. Just why not listen to children themselves?
Listening to children is also at the heart of the most important document on children's rights, the UNCRC or the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, where Article 12 states explicitly that it is the right of all children to be heard and taken seriously.
Listen to children. Talk to them. Spend time with them, but also when they tell you something, take it seriously, because, I think often there is just this sort of prejudice and arrogance that what do young people know, and when they tell you things, to not take it fully seriously. And I think if you just tempered that, so sort of were mindful of it and sort of ignored the prejudice when young people told you things and took it seriously, I think it would, make young people's mental health research, but also many things, much better.
And what it reminds me of was how women also faced, and in some cases still face, the situation where their agency and voice is not acknowledged. It has taken a long and hard fight which continues till date to have women speak for themselves and from their own experiences. Praveetha also emphasized how this is very similar in the case of children, but she had an additional really important point from the perspective of a researcher.
Yeah, I just think it's really important to do good research to understand, to ask young people themselves about how they're feeling, just as it's important to ask adults, and nobody questions that. But also often what we know from where you ask children and their parents, there's parents really, so the correlation or the association between the parent-reported symptoms and the children's own symptoms is very low, like so bad. So it's not only sort of, I think, arguments around children's rights and ethics and perspective being important, but also generally the data is bad. Like, to rely on somebody else to report on a young person's mental health just leads to bad data. So there's many reasons why I think it's important to ask young people about their own mental health.
With this approach of valuing the voice and agency of children at the heart of the research, the process of building the research questions itself shifts.
It's just about thinking about age-appropriate wording and understanding, right? So if you use adult words with a 7-year-old child, they're more likely to struggle with it. So, for example, we did a study recently, pre-pandemic, in Jharkhand, to try and validate a mental health measure with adolescents, so secondary school children. And so as part of that, obviously, we did the sort of more work with the experts and teachers and psychiatrists and so on. But we also had like focus groups with school children to basically be like, okay, when you answer this question, what are you thinking about? And what do you understand from these words? Like, how do you interpret this? Just to make sure it was, words and interpretations that was what they would use. So it's not, I don't think it's highly complicated to try and make and use measures that are for young people. All it takes is to spend some time talking to young people to make sure that the measure captures what you think it's capturing and is well understood by young people. So it's not sort of something that is so hard to do.
I really love how the process is in partnership with the children. And I think we all do this in so many ways, almost intuitively when we engage with kids around us, whether it's, parents, teachers, guardians, or caregivers. So there's no reason that research inquiries can't be reworked alongside children to truly understand their thoughts and experiences.
And I think with this sort of structure and methodology laid out to understand how one captures the genuine experiences of the children through research, we can now come to the bit about studying inequality and its effects on mental health. The particular axis of inequality that Praveetha has been looking at is gender.
So for most common mental health problems, such as depression and anxiety, from adolescence onwards, this gender gap appears where women have higher rates of depression and anxiety, and it remains through the life course. So at all other ages, so adult women, older women, have higher rates of depression and anxiety than men. And there's many sort of explanations proposed for this, and some of them range from the sort of biological hormonal type of ones to sort of more social and societal and risk-related ones. And there's no good sort of consensus on why the gender gap appears.
So this has been an area that she's really been interested in. Why does the gender gap in mental health appear? Why are women more vulnerable to poor mental health? Is this a universal phenomenon? These are questions she's been asking in her research. One such analysis she undertook was of a large international 2018 study from 70 countries around the world that also covered mental health questions.
So we asked a very simple question, which is the gender gap sort of the same across these 15-year-olds across 70 countries? And it's not. It's in some countries, there has hardly any gap. In very few countries, men have worse mental health. And in lots of countries, women have worse mental health, but the size of that gap really varies. So it's not like a universal constant. So for example, if you think about life expectancy, women around the world live longer than men. It's sort of a universal constant. It's something to do with, and it's not just true in humans, it's true in many, many different animals. Whereas with this gender gap, it's not like it's a given. There was massive heterogeneity between countries, which sort of suggests that there might be modifiable things about societies and expectations and women's roles in societies that could sort of contribute to the gender gap.
Okay, so her research very clearly is telling us that poor mental health isn't like a biologically determined difference within genders. It has a lot to do with the social context that girls and women occupy.
Exactly. And Praveetha explained how she correlated the experiences of young girls and what puts them at risk of having poor mental health as grown women with an example of sexual violence.
And so we're doing some work now looking at how adolescent girls who experience sexual violence, how their mental health develops. And it's a really, really strong risk factor. And it shouldn't be a surprise. But it is one of those things that girls disproportionately face compared to boys by miles. So usually it's like, if you look at the numbers here in the UK, there was a recent poll that said that between 18 and, sort of later adolescence, over 80% of young women reported sexual violence. And I'm sure it's the same in many countries of the world, and probably even worse in some. Whereas for men, it's like, always a couple percentage points. So it's really gendered risk factor. So yeah, again, I think this is sort of important, but also interesting because if we're saying it's not good for women that they have worse mental health through their lives, but I think really thinking about what is it about societies that create this sort of higher risk for women, and I think sexual violence is one of the most obvious things.
I think any girl will attest to the truth of this. I mean, the minute you're a teenager, your parents, relatives, society, everyone's occupied with schooling you on how to dress or how to behave, or constantly reminding you of the multiple vulnerabilities that come with being a young girl in this very patriarchal world. And there's a perception that mental health is an individual problem, but really we're all products of these really complex environments.
Yeah, Praveetha's research helps us see how elements of inequality like gender can heavily influence our lives. Again, something that the State of the World's Children Report 2021 has laid out particular emphasis on. They say socioeconomic and cultural factors in the wider world, as well as humanitarian crises and events like the COVID-19 pandemic, can all harm mental health. So hopefully in days ahead, more of us will connect how contexts of poverty, oppression, violence, gender, caste, class, all of these cause holistic harm, and that the conversation on well-being implies a society which addresses these issues together actively and stops isolating mental health as a purely individual or biological issue.
Yeah, and that's brought us full circle, hasn't it? I mean, we began this conversation discussing how children have been affected by this pandemic, which is this long unfolding disaster full of constant uncertainty and stress. And that's reorganized all our lives.
First of all, the pandemic is not over yet. So, we can't know fully. And there's obviously negative impacts of things like lockdowns and the isolation, but those were necessary public health measures. And then there's the impacts of the disease itself, right? So bereavement, so either losing loved ones to the pandemic or being severely infected. So we know, for example, people who are struggling with long COVID, so sort of, the disease that doesn't where you don't recover quickly. Again, low energy, brain fogs and stuff for a long time. And these are going to have impacts on mental health as well. So I think that the impacts of the pandemic, and then there's the sort of financial knock-on effects, right? The pandemic would, in many places, for many people, would have a decreased financial security, or, there might be more uncertainty, and lower financial security have always been bad for people's mental health. So I think the impacts of the pandemic it's not a straightforward thing. And it's really hard to isolate which impacts are because of isolation and which because of, the infection.
To state two such reports that I could find that had some data on India, the UN report stated that 1 in 7 of 15 to 24-year-olds in India reported often feeling depressed or having little interest in doing things during the pandemic. And a 2021 report released by Lokniti CSDS stated that more than 50% of youth aged 15 to 34 that they interviewed reported becoming angry over small matters. They also reported feeling sad, losing interest in daily activities, and being affected by loneliness during the last 2-3 years.
I remember reading how in December 2021, the US Surgeon General released an advisory on protecting youth mental health, outlining the pandemic's unprecedented impacts on the mental health of America's youth and families. So yeah, as much as we'd like to all move on and have the nightmare of the pandemic end, the truth is that the pandemic in its own way has been carrying urgent lessons about the change we need to make to build and become truly healthy and resilient as individuals and communities and as a society.
At the end of our conversation, we asked Praveetha, what can we as individuals do? What is the first step one can take towards a world that begins to address adolescent mental health instead of just shoving it under the rug? And I think as much as most of the conversation tended to lean on the academic side, this bit of simple advice felt human and very doable.
It's a huge question, but let's try a few possible small answers, which are not going to fix everything. But I think there's obviously the things about everyday things we do, right? So everyday decisions we make, but in how we think about ourselves and our mental health, but also how we react to others around us. So I think being more kind, being more considerate, realizing that other people might have problems we don't know about is really important, because it's easy to, because mental health difficulties you often can't see, but just because you can't see doesn't mean somebody's not struggling. So I think if we're all just slightly mindful that people might be struggling, that's one small thing we can all do.
I really like how she's broken that down, that one doesn't necessarily have to try and understand and respond to everything, but that there are small steps of empathy and kindness which we can take, and it's not to underestimate the power that it carries to change another's experience. I'm reminded of this lovely book, Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine, where a single person's friendship and kindness literally turns the life of the suffering protagonist around for the better.
I know, it can't be said enough. Empathy and kindness are both really powerful ways to open up spaces for young people, really anyone facing difficult situations, for them to feel seen, heard, understood, held. These seem like small actions, but can have tremendous impact on someone who might be feeling lonely or isolated. I mean, I can attest to this personally, how much it meant for me that people, my family, friends, community, all of them made it so much more easier to manage our COVID quarantine by simple acts of asking after us or sending food. Even under physical isolation, it made us feel seen and less alone in a difficult time.
And I often think how from that first step, a journey of larger systemic change of responsive communities, supportive institutions and policies, all of it can begin. And COVID has taught us what helps with physical illness. There seems no reason to not apply those lessons just as enthusiastically to our mental well-being.
Praveetha has published widely on this topic, and her work can be explored further online. In our next conversation, we're excited to hear from Shireen Ansari, a young woman who was part of a leaders' lab that conducted research to understand the lived experience of young girls and women during the pandemic and then put together recommendations for supportive action. We'll also hear from Swarnlata Mahilkar, who works as a Girl Fellow at Empower, a grant-making organization that supports partners working with marginalized youth. Don't forget to listen in.
Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more episodes. You can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or a podcast app of your convenience. We're also on YouTube, so look up the channel, The Curio-city Collective, or follow us through our social media pages. And most importantly, if you like what you're hearing, please do share these episodes with your family, friends, and community members. Leave us your thoughts, comments, and feedback. We love hearing from you.
TCC is a not-for-profit initiative that is funded by you, the listeners. If you'd like to support the work that we do at TCC, there are different ways that are listed on the support and contribute page of our website, www.thecuriocitycollective.org. You can also write to us at team@thecuriocitycollective.org or message us on 6300711451 if you feel called to make a contribution to sponsor an episode or a podcast series. This could help us with our research, writing, admin, and editing costs to build further resources that speak to our collective well-being. We hope you'll join us on this journey of co-creating the space to nurture and build cities that are healthy and happy. This podcast was created by Srinidhi Raghavan, Deepika Khatri, and Arpita Joshi. The sound editing was by Vijay Chawla.